You're listening to Systemic Error Podcast. The failure was designed.
The Trump regime just put a target on my back, based on an article by Tom Hartman. Border panic was only the test run. The real client is power. The source sketches a familiar sequence, a public story about border security, then mass detention, then raids that stop pretending to target criminals, then arrests of legal residents and political opponents. That arc matters more than the bait. The issue was never simply immigration enforcement. It was the construction of a state tool that could be widened until it fit anyone the White House wanted to punish. The people with actual power here are not the gardeners, the mosque president, or the protestors now getting swept into the net. The power sits with Trump, Stephen Miller, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, and the ICE apparatus they command or amplify. They decide who gets labeled dangerous, which institutions get funded, and which kinds of violence are treated as routine. ICE was built for expansion. The detention system did not appear overnight. The source traces it back through Reagan-era detention policy, private prison contracts, and Trump's wall and crime theater. That history is the point. Once a machinery exists, its next use is rarely its last use. Funding, contracts, databases, and detention beds create a political asset for whoever wants coercion without accountability. This is why reform is the wrong frame for ICE. A more humane press release does not change what the agency is for. ICE should be abolished, not patched. An agency that can be scaled for mass detention can be scaled for political repression. The source is describing that scaling in real time. The lie was never subtle. The border panic was sold as a crusade against the worst of the worst. Then the targets became workers like Jose the gardener and Maria the maid, according to the source's account. That is not enforcement drift. That is the reveal. The promised distinction between criminals and everyone else was never the operating principle. It was the sales pitch. Once the state starts treating racialized suspicion as probable cause, the label criminal becomes disposable. It can be attached to whoever is convenient. That is how mass deportation politics works. First it demands public fear, then it cashes that fear in as administrative power. Dissent is the new contraband. The arrest of Salazar is the clearest sign that the target has moved from status to speech. A legal permanent resident with no criminal record was held for 80 days, lost weight, was denied diabetes monitoring, and was released only after a judge found he had been targeted for his political views on Palestinian rights. That is not a border policy glitch. It is political detention with paperwork. NSPM 7 makes the drift explicit. The White House memorandum's language about anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, extremism on migration, and hostility toward traditional views gives the game away. Dissent is being recoded as security risk. That is the administrative vocabulary of repression. It converts political disagreement into a pretext for arrest. Rubio's list is the cover story. Marco Rubio's Cuba document functions as a blacklist with better design. It names activists, media figures, elected officials, and organizations as part of a supposed foreign-aligned network. The source is right to read it as more than anti-Cuba rhetoric. It is a licensing document for suspicion, a way to collapse labor groups, anti-ICE organizers, socialists, and journalists into one imagined enemy class. The presence of officials like Stephen Miller, Kash Patel, Scott Bessent, and Linda McMahon at the rollout matters. This is not fringe paranoia. It is institutional staging. The state is assembling a record that makes repression look bureaucratic and therefore normal. That is how authoritarian projects travel. They move through memos, briefings, naming conventions, and databases before they move through cages. The pattern is the point. The source argues that the architecture is now in place. Detention money, masked agents, surveillance systems, and impunity. That is the important political fact. Repression does not need to begin with mass purges to be real. It begins when the state learns it can punish the vulnerable, test the courts, ignore deaths in custody, and then widen the target set to include critics, organizers, and elected opponents. That is the pattern here. Border hysteria built the machinery. Anti-immigrant politics normalized the cruelty. Anti-protest policing expanded the use case. Now ideological targeting is being layered on top. The people steering this are not confused. They are building a domestic security state and trying to dress it up as public order. The democratic response cannot be sentimental. It has to name the institution, the command chain, and the purpose. ICE is not broken in a way that better training will fix. It is functioning as designed. You've been listening to Systemic Error. Thanks to Alternet for today's article. With the automated voice of Clara, thanks for listening.